Okay, guys, so today we are talking about Shays Rebellion. And I can't impress upon you how big, how important this topic is. The details surrounding it aren't as big as the impact that it had. The impact that it had was far, far larger than the events itself. In fact, a lot of historians really think about this as being one of the handful of days that changed and shaped America. So let's get into exactly what it was and why and how it shaped the country. So first thing we need to know is that after the Revolutionary War, a lot of farmers that had been soldiers, right? They had been away in some cases for years. It makes it really hard to pay your debts. It makes it really hard to grow your crops and to sell those and to manage your family farm without the owner of the farm there, right? And so what we're going to see is that a lot of these farmers were really deeply in debt and they had no way to pay that debt. Without opportunity to pay that debt back, there were only a few things that could happen. They were thrown in debtor's prison until they could pay it off. The problem is, if you're not on your farm to grow crops, how do you sell crops for a profit and then use the profit to get yourself out of debtor's prison? Right. So what's happening is a lot of these farmers are being thrown into debtor's prison, and in order to pay for their release, a lot of farms are being sold. If you're not thrown into debtor's prison, your farm may be foreclosed on, taken back by the bank, because a lot of people had to take out loans in order to purchase their farm in the first place. So either way, it results in the loss of your land, the loss of your farm. And as we've said in this class before, land equals opportunity. Without land, you couldn't vote. Without land, you had no livelihood. You had no opportunity. And so for a lot of these farmers who had supported the war, who had fought in the war, they were really struggling now and facing financial disaster. So what we're going to see is that a lot of these angry farmers kind of band together and they kind of get this a little bit of a mob mentality. They feed off of one another and they begin to rebel. Americans, especially early on when there's something that we don't like, you see them taking up arms and really rebelling. They're going to do this under the leadership of a former soldier, right, by the name of Daniel Shays. And that's why we get the name Shays Rebellion. So he's going to lead them. Now, they're going to begin by taking over courthouses. They march into these little towns and then they force their way into courthouses. The courthouses aren't usually guarded, right? They force their way in there because if they can take over the courthouse, they can stop the proceedings. And the proceedings at the courthouse are the ones where farms are being foreclosed on. So by taking over these courthouses, they're stopping foreclosures. As they do that, more and more people are going to kind of join and rally to the cause. And so it becomes larger and larger. They're taking over more and more courthouses. Think Sons of Liberty. There are buildings being burned. There are people being chased out. It's really kind of growing into a movement. And the movement is going from west to east towards the larger city of Boston. So the people of Boston are starting to get a little bit worried. They're feeling very threatened, especially the wealthy Bostonians, right? They're going to call on the government to put down this rebellion. This isn't right. They disagree with this, and they want to see it dealt with. And so there is a little bit of a problem here, right? The problem being that the federal government is too weak. There is a lot more power at the state level, but at the federal level, there's no executive, there's no president. And so, you know, if you take this to the federal government, a lot of people aren't going to maybe understand from other states and whatnot. They're not going to feel it's a priority. And so it's kind of having too many cooks in the kitchen. Congress, go ahead and take a look at them today and every day in our history. Fairly ineffective, right? A lot of stalemate, a lot of political maneuvering, and not a lot of action. And so with no executive to kind of take charge during a time of crisis, you're in real trouble. You also had no standing army. So it's not like you could call the army out and say, go put this rebellion down. The Articles of Confederation didn't allow for that. So there was really no way for the federal government to stop Shays Rebellion. That is kind of the big point of this, right? Now, the next thing that we see is it does get put down. The wealthy Bostonian business owners, they're going to get together, they're going to collectively pool some money, and they're going to commission a private army, right? and that army marches out. They meet Shays Rebellion, they put it down and kind of disperse the crowds and so forth. But here's kind of the big takeaway. Do we really want business? Do we want the wealthy to be able to form their own armies and rely upon that to deal with problems and crises throughout this country? I think most of us would answer, no, we really don't want that, right? That's not the place of business. That gives them too much power. That could be a pretty dangerous thing, right? Because the interest of business may not always be, sometimes they might be, but they may not always be aligned with the interest of the country at large. So what we're going to see is that while Shays Rebellion was ultimately unsuccessful, the thing that it really did for a lot of people is it shone a light on the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. So when you think of Shays Rebellion, I want you to think of a flashlight, right? Shining a beam on the... Listen, the Articles of Confederation were weak. There were cracks in it. There were weaknesses. There were all sorts of things that maybe we hadn't seen. In our excitement about winning our independence, in our excitement about starting a new government, in our desire to address all the things that we feared so much, we overlooked a lot. And it hadn't been an issue. We'd been bumping along the road for several years under the Articles of Confederation just fine. But now that a crisis is taking place, it kind of highlights, throws into stark relief all of the problems of the Articles of Confederation. It convinced a lot of people that, well, we may have swung too far against federal power. We may have swung too far against an executive, that there's a time and a place. So I think there's still the desire to limit those things, to place restrictions on those things, but you need them in place nonetheless. And so this kind of begins the conversation and starts moving us towards what will be the eventual discarding of the Articles of Confederation and replacing them with our current Constitution. Now, when it comes to Shays Rebellion, the details in there don't really matter all that much, I would argue, right? It really is how the thing ended up. It's tragic because in the end of the day, we feel for Shays, we feel for the farmers who were losing their farms after their service to the country. But if we're being honest, there's not really a bad guy here, right? The banks that had loaned money, this wasn't out of the goodness of their heart. They had to get it back if they were going to be viable, and we need banks to loan money for other people. So I think a lot of times our inherent interest lies with the people. Certainly mine do, but at the same time, we have to understand that there's a place for banks and that they're a very needed institution if we're going to grow and allow more people to find opportunity. And so there's not really a bad guy in this Shays Rebellion story. It's not with Shays, I don't think, right? I understand their anger and their frustration. It's not with the banks. The banks were doing what the banks had to do to stay viable. But what we really come out with is, again, that light being shown on the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. So with that said, we're all done. Guys, go ahead and watch what leads up to this or what comes after. We're going to start to talk about the Constitution. But please go ahead and subscribe and watch some of the other videos. It's been a pleasure talking to you guys. Thanks.